Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Biology Podcasts. Our next podcast is on cell respiration. So let's go over a short overview on cell respiration. First of all, cell respiration includes pathways that require oxygen. In cell respiration, glucose, which is a sugar, is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. Glucose breakdown is therefore an oxidation-reduction reaction, and if you worry about things like oxidation reduction reactions, we're going to talk a little bit about what I want you to know as far as redox reactions go. The breakdown of one glucose molecule, though, results in 36 to 38 ATP molecules, and this is due to inefficiencies in biological systems. So it's not always exactly 36 and it's not always exactly 38. There's a range. So the overall equation for cell respiration reads as follows. We have C6H12O6, which is glucose. We have 6O2, which is oxygen. And those will break down to produce carbon dioxide, water, an electron, which I don't really want you to worry about too much, and then 36 to 38 ATP. So what type of process is cellular respiration? As I said before, it's an oxidation reduction process, or what we call a redox reaction. Now in chemistry you'll go through a lot more detail on redox reactions, but for biology the basics behind it is that glucose is oxidized, and what that means is that we take electrons and we remove them from a glucose molecule. Now those electrons need to go somewhere. The end product of oxidizing glucose is carbon dioxide and water. And as I said, these electrons need to go somewhere, and so the electrons go to oxygen. They're transferred to oxygen to turn oxygen into water, and that is the basics to a redox reaction. Now during this process here, this oxidation reduction, this is where we generate ATP. So electrons need to be carried. They can't just float freely. And electrons are carried by electron carriers. One of those electron carriers is this guy here, NAD+. So NAD+ picks up an electron, becomes reduced to NADH, and NADH is then able to carry that electron to the ATP producing areas. When it detaches that electron, it goes back to NAD+. Now also note that there's hydrogen ions involved. There is another electron carrier, and that's FAD+. Now it's important to note that both of these are coenzymes. So in other words, they're vitamins that exist in our body. And FAD+ is reduced to FADH2. So again, all that means is that it's picking up electrons, and those electrons are then able to be carried to the places that produce ATP. So what are the stages of cell respiration? Cell respiration can be broken down into 3 different stages. The first of those stages is glycolysis. The second is the Krebs cycle, and the third is the electron transport chain. And we're going to look at all 3 of those coming up. But first of all, let's look at where it takes place. And there's 2 parts of the cell that will find cell respiration. We'll find cell respiration. The first stage is glycolysis, and glycolysis actually occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. The other stages, the Krebs and the electron transport chain, they take place in the mitochondria. Now if we look at the mitochondria is composed of a smooth outer membrane. That's this right here. It's composed of a folded inner membrane, and remember the folds are going to increase surface area. And so that's the purpose of the folds. We call the folds cristae, and the space inside the cristae, right here, this fluid, that's the mitochondrial matrix. Now, what's neat about the mitochondria is that it's got its own set of DNA. They reproduce independently of the body. We'll talk a little bit more about mitochondria when we look at evolution, because we can actually trace human origins based on mitochondrial evidence. So let's diagram the process of cell respiration. Cell respiration begins with a glucose molecule. That glucose molecule is broken down in glycolysis. Now glycolysis produces a little bit of ATP and it produces electron carriers. Now note that in several different pathways we get electron carriers. And those electron carriers are eventually going to produce the bulk of ATP. So glycolysis will interact with another vitamin called coenzyme A. Now coenzyme A is really just vitamin C. So remember in enzymes when I said that's important for cell respiration. Coenzyme A will move into the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle produces electron carriers, the same as every other process. It also produces a little bit of ATP, and notice that the carbon dioxide is released in the Krebs cycle. The final process is the electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain produces the bulk of the ATP, bulk ATP. So let's look at glycolysis. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. It's anaerobic, meaning that it doesn't require oxygen. So glycolysis does require the input of 2 ATP. So in order to get cell respiration going, we need to add ATP. In glycolysis, glucose is split into 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Same thing. Now glycolysis also produces 4-NADH, and remember these are electron carriers, and 4 ATP. So our net ATP production is 2 ATP, because remember we have to input 2 ATP. One important process to note is that when oxygen's not present, we have fermentation which can happen. So when oxygen is present, the pyruvates will move into the Krebs cycle for aerobic respiration. But when oxygen's not present, we move into anaerobic fermentation. And so in humans, that fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation. And what the body will do is it'll convert pyruvate molecules into lactic acid. This process uses the NADH that would have been used for electron carriers and produces lactic acid plus some ATP. So we can imagine when we're working out and we're not giving our muscles enough oxygen, this is where we start to feel the burn. Okay, this is where we feel the burn from a workout, and this is really just that lactic acid building up in our muscles and makes our muscles tired. Now within yeast, they do something very similar, but in that case it's alcoholic fermentation. Okay, both of these processes only net about 2 ATP. They're very inefficient. So here's a quick diagram of alcohol fermentation, remember used by yeast, and this one is used by the muscles in our body. Lactic acid. So maybe pause the podcast and make a quick diagram of those processes. Okay, let's look at the Krebs cycle next. So the Krebs cycle requires oxygen. So when oxygen is available, pyruvate will move into the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is really just a series of reactions. Those reactions give off CO2 and they produce 1 ATP per cycle. The Krebs cycle turns twice per glucose molecule because remember, glycolysis produces 2 pyruvates. Okay, so in that case it spins twice. It also produces 2 ATP, and this takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. So in other words, each turn of the Krebs cycle produces 3 NADH, remember those are electron carriers, 1 FADH2, remember that's another electron carrier, and 2 CO2, and those are waste products. CO2 is waste. So for each glucose molecule, for 1 glucose, the Krebs cycle produces 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, 4 CO2, and 2 ATP. So this is a quick diagram showing us the Krebs cycle. I'd never ask you to know these right here, but the important thing to note is that it's cyclical, meaning that every reaction sort of moves around in a circle from start to finish. It produces along the way NADH, it produces carbon dioxide, and it also produces some ATP. We still haven't had the bulk, because remember, the bulk of ATP, or ATP production, we're looking for 36 to 38 ATP. And we don't have it yet in the Krebs and glycolysis combined. And that's where the electron transport chain comes in. This is where the bulk of ATP is produced. Now, another byproduct is water. It occurs in the cristae. And here's where those electron carriers come into play. So the electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, interact in the electron transport chain, and for every one NADH, we get 3 ATP produced. For every one FADH2, we get 2 ATP produced. So remember that glycolysis produced 4 NADH, Krebs produced some more electron carriers, and all of these electron carriers are going to be used to produce ATP. Okay, and that brings up the next slide, and this one right here we're going to do in class, but really what I want you to do is copy down a table similar to this in your notes and fill in the production of, or the location of each of the molecules, how much NADH is produced in each of those stages, how much FADH2 is produced, and the ATP production. And that concludes our podcast on cell respiration, and I hope that was helpful.